we are something better. So we are having Streamr, we are having Kaiko, we are having AmberData, we are having CLC Group,
Hi, I'm Rika.
Share their experience,
I'm
blockchain work,
but also work for
Streamr
platform.
So I guess the best way to start this panel is for everyone to introduce themselves, what they're doing, and we can get started from there.
So yeah, very big.
I wonder if the neighbors are a bit noisy. No, I think we'll be fine. All right, so hey, I'm Henri, co-founder and head of the Streamr project. So what is Streamr? Streamr is a peer-to-peer network for real-time data streams. So my favorite one-liners to explain Streamr to a technical audience, which I assume this audience is that it's a decentralized pub/sub message broker. You can also think of it as a global decentralized time series database, or if you will, it's a bit like BitTorrent, but for real-time data streams instead of static files. So basically, a data source can publish messages to topics on the network, and they will magically be delivered to all the subscribers listening to that topic. And these interacting parties could be like IoT devices in a smart city. They could be web browsers using a DApp. They could be oracles seeking to deliver that data to an on-chain smart contract. Also in the Streamr ecosystem, there's a marketplace, which is a means to monetize the data that is being produced. So if you're producing something that's valuable to others, you can put it up for sale.
Yeah. So
and we also have a toolkit called Streamr Core, which is actually being officially launched today. Yeah. Thank you. Always good to ship things.
Basically,
that's like a toolkit where you can easily create integrations. You can build analytics and visualizations. You can get your hands dirty with data.
13 applications
And manage literally stuff in the same place. So that's pretty much Streamr in a nutshell.
that match criteria.
So Andrew from the CLC,
offline on the board.
hosting the panel. Thanks for Chainlink for putting this together. Nice to see lots of ecosystem members coming
Basically, we are inviting everyone,
CLC
not
is
only
a smart contract
right now
lab
sits
built
here,
in
but
on and
anyone that
specifically
is
for Chainlink. Right now, our main product
look
is the Honeycomb Marketplace.
at the project
There we
and
have
vote
together, I think we have
or
15
join
up right now. But
if they want to join a
API
project
providers
to
that are
solve
putting
this
out there,
particular challenge.
we
There are
think
5
are some of the
projects.
most exciting data types, the ones
And by leaving the
empower
contact
the use
details
cases that
here,
we've been talking about for
I don't
years
know
and
how
years
we're going
now.
to do it.
We have sports data, we have
since
weather
you're
data, we
sitting
have
here,
real world
you're not going anywhere
data.
for some time.
We have API
You
endpoints
even
that
have to
let you
actually
do things
leave the
like send
text.
texts, telephone
So
calls. That's cool functionality in your contracts. We offer
I'm just going to quickly introduce 5 projects. You can,
test calls. It's
after
really a
that, you
marketplace
can
designed for developers.
see the projects yourself. You can also scan the QR codes as 4 projects have submitted additional documents, so you can actually scan and read.
And once you're ready to get everything to production, we then offer
And
the
it will
data
first
at a flat
quickly talk about Grace.
so you can test for free. We can't
Grace
give
when you
you all
can.
endpoints for free. We can't have folks, calling the Vatican and charges and things like that. But most data points are free. And from a business development perspective, is that we've got multiple data sources for many of these most types of data. So you can get, depending on the sport, multiple sports data providers.
The challenge, what they are proposing is that they have tracking solution where they want to track donations right from the donor to the beneficiary. And they also mentioned that they have 2 projects working in the similar space. One is of course to Tibet and the other before which I believe it's blockchain for humanity, right? So this is the idea, but then they also mentioned that okay,
We're also working on
if it's future or money
security
then
service for APIs. I don't think I'm
but
allowed
what
to
if
talk
it's
too much
good
about
for
it just yet. But
so is there a solution?
So our ultimate goal is to sort of
So
have a
is there a
product and
solution
something
where
available for each
they are
component
still able
of the
to track
ecosystem. And with the marketplace that's out today, we really think we using it now for developers. We got rid of a lot of the pain points that they're going to run into. Now they don't have to go out and find data providers, then find node operators that can provide the data, and they don't have to, deal with all the legal stuff either. We've got all that covered, so all they have to do is build the contracts. We're hoping to do that for everybody else eventually too. So again, thanks to Johan, thanks to the team.
Hi everyone, my name is Robert, and when I come to Seth, thanks to Chainlink for making this happen. It's great to be able to meet all you people. I'm working with Kaiko. We're a market data provider for financial market data for the crypto market. So for several years now, we have been collecting, creating and providing raw data and aggregated derived data for cryptocurrency markets exchanges. Also providers. We're having a way of historical data feeds, so you can get historical data, WebSockets, and core APIs, mostly targeted to investors and researchers in the space. But now, as we see that DeFi is starting to grow, we're also have been starting to work seriously with integrating with bringing market data to on-chain smart contracts. The first initiative that we launched in production was with Chainlink, so we're running our own node as an operator and also as a market data provider. So our whole query API with all our data is exposed, so you can do micro payment transactions per call and get both live and historical data to your smart contracts. And we're keeping a close eye on what's happening in the DeFi space and want to be able to accommodate all the use cases that there are. So if you're building stuff and market data for smart contracts and you feel like your needs aren't covered today, please contact us. It's always interesting to see what people want to build and how they want to do it.
Particularly in Congo and
thank you.
Kazakhstan.
So I'm Trevor Clarke. I'm with AmberData IO, and so we're actually a data provider that covers a couple different fronts. Similar to Kaiko, we actually do cryptocurrency market data as well as blockchain data. So we have a data pipeline that's fairly flexible, where developers can connect to our data pipeline and add all of the features that they're looking for their application without having to run a full node or connect to multiple exchanges and verify those transactions and match them up with that market data. So if you look at how most people are building their applications, you at some point need to send a transaction. And so what we did is everything we build for you runs a node, and you can sign your transactions, you can have your users not have to pay a fee or anything like that. You can send that to our API, you can have the full context of market data, and then on the flip side, when you're serving your applications, it's much faster. So our access via RPC or WebSockets or REST services, all of that is just kind of one big package that streamlines your application. Similar to Kaiko, we have full current and historical prices like VWAP, OHLCV, order books, all of that available via WebSockets as well.
So I guess a question we could ask is, this industry is so new, right? There are a lot of gray zones, regulatory-wise, so what kind of legal issues have you encountered by providing data to the blockchain? Who wants to go first? Legal Hispanico.
Sure. One of the big things I think we've run into is that we want to be helping people build the contracts that enable all the cool DeFi applications, all the cool derivatives and insurance. But in many cases, the data providers themselves are often a little anxious about it. They come to us and say, we don't know who's going to be using the data or what they're going to be using it for. And of course, in the back of our heads, we're saying, well, that's one of the cool things, but you can't say that out loud. You got to get them on board. So then we'll work with them on these really onerous know your customer requirements, or we're talking right now with a lot of authorized resellers, and so that gives them a little legal protection, but it also increases the price. And so all of these solutions have their own kind of problems. right now, if you want to get a really top-tier data provider on board, the API, they need to know who the node operator is, they need to know who the developer is, and they need to know who the end user is. And so now we have this wonderful, elegant system that can do all these cool new things, but there are these bits of paper at every step, causing all this friction. And so I think looking forward, one of the things we're really going to need to figure out from a regulatory standpoint is how to get some standards, how to get some of this paper out of the way. Because it's really tough to imagine smart contracts getting to the level of ubiquity I think a lot of us do if there's going to be all these issues and all this regulation rolling downhill onto the end user. So right now, I'm a really big fan of any organization working on big major industry-wide standards. I think what Accord is doing is fantastic. I think some of the stuff that OpenLaw is doing is going to be really useful. And maybe we should be thinking about that from a data provider standpoint for smart contracts. If a couple of smart contract data providers wanted to work together on some standards.
There's more information in the QR code again, like they have
more like
quite some
standard on the license and the terms.
I think they would go hand in hand very likely. But figuring out something so that the API providers know what they're signing beforehand, that's going to help some get these big names more comfortable.
Because in many ways, I mean, the blockchain is transparent also in who has subscribed to what, and I mean, you could have these identity services and all that. In theory, you could implement all that with the blockchain, but of course the question is, what's the benefit?
I think we're going to talk about sort of privacy and user stuff a little bit later, but yeah, that is the issue.
Whatever they're working in this case,
I could maybe add on to that a little bit. I'm just talking here from the perspective of financial market data, since that's what we're dealing with. What we've seen is that there's not so much in terms of legal regulations, but there's a lot of self-regulation from within the financial sector. So when it comes to specifically when we're working, so we're like an intermediary data provider, right? So we provide data, but we're getting that data from other data providers, essentially the sources of the data. And when we're working with pure crypto, like crypto exchanges, we don't have that much trouble there. It's usually very pragmatic and they're easy to talk to and collaborate with. But when we go to like the older actors in the space, like index providers, companies like that, suddenly you have a lot of bureaucracy and red tape and things like that. And I think there's both a willingness from them to they want to provide data for people like our customers, but they're also having these internal frameworks and like internal regulations that they have to comply with. So I think this will be solved both, as you say, from like talking to each other and trying to arrive at standards, and also just I think a lot of this people aren't really aware of exactly how things work. So you have to kind of like take the time to understand where they're coming from and talk to them about how can we align things so that it makes sense. And a lot of them want to have a strict control of how their data is disseminated. And of course, like as soon as you put the data point on a public blockchain, it's out there in the public, and you have to see how you can accommodate from that. And I think that will just be solved by talking to each other and it will work itself out.
Yeah.
Just one tiny thing to add there. You said a lot of awesome stuff. Just to add on that, from our integrations, a lot of their compliance is their side of the wall. So what we've done is made our APIs available to them. The way that they access that data is how that compliance, it has to be compliant with the access there. So we've just made that so that it fits their model as well. And I'm sure you guys have done that as well.
From our point of view, the sort of legal hassles are a little bit different, as we're building a platform, which is an open platform, where anybody can put any kind of data on there. And we're sort of not a party in the transactions that happen in the ecosystem. So if someone buys data, someone sells data, we're not a part of it in the same way as you guys are. So the considerations for us are more like how do we enable adoption? How do we prevent our users from stepping accidentally on some landmines in this jungle that is legal environment, and how to consider things like GDPR, for example, in the case of personally identifiable data. And what are our liabilities as creators of this technology as opposed to those who put it there? Let's say someone publishes some illegal content, for example, on the Streamr network. Are we somehow liable for that? Maybe in the current version, which is still partially centralized, there's still an element of us as the creators of this system. But especially when it goes towards full decentralization, how can this work from a legal point of view? And this actually touches on all decentralized systems, and the current legal framework, such as GDPR, doesn't consider decentralized systems at all. It's clearly aimed for the big giants who've several times been caught at abusing data and so on. So it's interesting to see what the future holds. Like, for example, if I post a transaction on Ethereum with, let's say, somebody's name and address and phone number, that's personally identifiable data. I don't think all the Ethereum nodes are GDPR compliant. So does that make Ethereum illegal? Could I make Ethereum illegal by doing one transaction? Very interesting question.
Awesome answers. Okay, so I guess this question is more for CLC group and streamers. So for API providers, we are more used to having monthly subscription, right? So you subscribe to an API for a monthly basis and you get the API price feed that you need, basically. So you guys went with a different pricing model. So maybe you could expand a bit on what kind of pricing model you're using right now and why you went this route.
Sure. So on the Streamr marketplace, we do have time-based subscriptions, but it's not bound to a specific period, like a month or a year. Instead, you can subscribe for data for the period that you want. So the price of data is basically defined as price per time unit, like price per second sort of thing. So you can buy it for an hour, or a week, or a month, or a year, or like 10 years, or whatever you want. And this creates flexibility. Like in the old world, writing invoices and accepting credit card payments and settling everything is a hurdle, but on blockchain it's sort of trivial. So you can very easily create new kinds of patterns, even ones that are based on, let's say, data quantity instead of time, which is a very interesting prospect. But we went with the time-based subscriptions for now for two reasons. One, it's familiar to people and data subscribers, and two, it leads to a fairly modest amount of on-chain transactions that need to be made. Like if you buy a product for a month, you will only do one transaction per month. Instead, if it was based on something else, that might result in a lot of transactions that would eventually be available in the current day blockchain.
Yeah, I think one of the things that's really important to remember when talking about how APIs should be or could be pricing for the smart contract space in the world is that smart contracts are not currently and probably never will be particularly high volume or high call use cases. Where a sports or a player app needs thousands and thousands of calls a day to stay up or stay up to second for your users, the smart contract instead executes one or two calls from a couple different nodes to different sources to find out the price, XYZ for a node score at the end of the game, or know if it's raining at a certain time, or the contracts Brock is demoing on Wednesday, you should buy instead. And so these are not high call use cases. And so when the API world
itself is massively under threat through
trying to get as
three
many
main
calls
like
out
one
there as
is
possible.
ecological.
That's how they make
So
their money.
if the temperatures
So we're
rise
talking
by
to these financial
3 to
data
5
providers,
degrees,
and they ask us, when are you going to get to a million calls a month? Chainlink has 140,000 calls on the entire network. That's in 3 months. I don't know what
this looks like it's going to happen within the next 20 to
one financial
15
data
years.
provider through whatever percentage
The next gap is political threat. So you
so you
have
need to incentivize
also
them to
like
enter into the space
Bolsonaro,
in a different way.
you know, who are basically selling massive
change
swings
the
of the
model, that's
jungle
what
to
we've done.
gold
We're,
mining, to oil mining,
charging
to mineral mining.
in a relatively higher per call
These miners
for
are
a different set of service
coming into these indigenous people's
the sort of
lives.
standard that we've seen across premium APIs providing data in a Fortune 500 companies is 99.8%. For some reason, that's the benchmark.
Then you have
Everybody
social
wants to get
pressures. So the youth
and for
of
a
these
currently
communities
expensive system
are
like a smart contract, whose
they
value
don't
is derived
necessarily be
in part
modernized,
by
so they
being
don't really
reliable,
want to learn new ways.
99.8%
And
isn't
so
going to cut
once
it.
this,
So we're going to pay them
this
a little bit more
conceptual
money,
connection
give us greater
to these
dependability,
medicinal
and
plants
to make
is
sure that they
lost,
stay in the space when they're not going
then
to get the call
we have no
volumes that
idea
they
what they
expect.
are. So I was in Peru last year, and I met with some members of
We started at first thinking about it
Massive,
from a node operator perspective.
they
The
let a
subscription
photographer
model and
into
freemium
their
APIs
village to take
that wouldn't
photographs of
encourage
the
a lot of
medicinal
node
plants.
operators. That was going to cost
And so I was shown a book.
But after talking with the API providers,
The book had like 6 to 8 photographs of medicinal plants per page.
we sort of
And it's that
collectively
big.
came to the decision
Like
that
this is how many plants there are.
And so that's
And this is like everyone needs big sexy ones like ayahuasca, peyote.
Makes a lot of sense. Alright.
These are more for
So I guess that question is more for AmberData and Kaiko.
like swelling,
So
for asthma, for like
if you had to guess, or maybe you have an estimate, how much of the current codes that are being brought to your APIs are used by smart contracts, and how do you see this number changing in the near future?
cultural data, what other plants
Yeah,
are used to
basically, that's
activate
it.
various compounds in the plants, and then collateral this stuff and put it on.
So we actually look at
and then do like
several
physical
blockchains,
hashes
so we can
on,
see those analytics overall.
Bitcoin, whatever chain.
For us, we get a nice breakdown from the network
And the idea
where we
of
can see
open sourcing
individual
it
addresses
so that it's
plus
not just
contracts.
pharmaceutical
So for
companies,
us, if you went to our dashboards today, it would show you actually like 54% were contracts, and the rest of the network was addresses itself. We're actually pretty new to the Chainlink setup, so we're still watching the Chainlink network analytics, which is really exciting to see that grow. From our perspective, it's still pretty low. Compared to all contracts, it's roughly less than 1%. So that's something that we're like, hey, let's see if we can encourage that growth there, because we really liked this interaction and the amount of data that you can get from a Chainlink Oracle contract is actually awesome. Because you can aggregate those prices historically, it now becomes something like an aggregator contract that people can look back historically, which is something that you can do and validate your logic over time. One of our core use cases is people that are doing arbitrage bots, and so they actually like to run the historical data sets and then test their assumptions and take that back on chain. You can actually do that now with the Oracle contracts, and you could, I'm hoping, create a marketplace for those aggregators and those bots and arbitrage numbers later. But
they told me a story about when they went to
Yeah, we have actually seen
a village of a Brazilian
almost
tribe
close
called
to
the
zero
Yawa.
actual usage
And
of
the
our
Yawa they were invaded by Christian missionaries 100 years ago.
and I think this may have something to
The
do with our
missionaries
profiling
said
as a
like, okay, you
provider.
guys work
We're
with
targeting
nature,
a little bit
you
more
have this
the
spiritual
institutional
relationship
and
with
enterprise
Christ,
space.
you know, all this stuff.
There
That's
I
all
think
bullshit.
they're a bit more cautious.
The real religion is Jesus Christ name, not Luther. And so they installed a church, they basically forbid them to worship or to
feedback when we
work with
announced
the
that we're
culture
doing
in
this.
traditional
I
ways.
think there's a lot of interest
And
there.
then in the 1970s,
That we're going to,
the
it's definitely
chief of
going to grow,
Yawa
but I think the whole space is still in an exploratory phase, and any more usage that we would see would be from other people who are also like
but when we
either
tried to
startups
revitalize the culture, a lot of the elders had died.
I think it will be at least another year until we say how this is going to really start to take off.
They need some of the songs, they need some of the...
I think we need the exact same conclusion as needed when it came to the pricing model. So for our main services, we have a license whereas we also came to the conclusion this doesn't really make sense for smart contracts, we think. So we're doing the microtransactions there, but we're also going to do other initiatives where we're going to evaluate the subscription model and we're going to see what catches on and how are people using this in practice. So I think we have to give different ways of using and consuming and paying for data to see what aligns with users.
For them, so that they will be able to run like a sort of pre-management system, be able to...
Alright, so maybe you could tell us how the needs of smart contract developers differ from, let's say, web app developers, or, you know, like the more traditional developers we used to, and how are you catering to those needs? You know, like how are you adapting your system to make sure that they're happy using it, basically? So...
I guess the reason I came here...
Sort of adding to what was already said, for us,
I'm trying to find
also like smart contracts are one of the subscribers that they have
build this
in addition to the stuff that we're doing with Chainlink, which is sort of the first step to bridge data from Streamr to smart contracts, we also offer some tooling for sort of boosting that side of things. In the stuff that we're building ourselves, for example, in the Streamr core app, we can connect data to smart contracts. But other than that, in our use case, the sort of smart contract developers are more or less on their own in that sense. We try to hold their hands and bring people into the ecosystem and sort of facilitate the discovery of how you can build data-driven smart contracts. But as we've identified, it's like limited by certain factors, for example, the scalability of blockchain, which should in the future boost adoption of using smart contracts as application backends in a huge way, but it's a slow progress, right?
Yeah, I think right now APIs are built for speed and throughput. How quickly can we get you calls and how many calls can we get you? This almost doesn't matter for smart contracts as much because, again, they're a low-call use case. That might change a little bit once you start trusted execution environments and off-chain communication. But I still think the majority of the really high-value use cases that we're all excited about, they're never going to be high-call ones. And the speed doesn't matter because right now it's always. So what smart contract developers need instead is something else. They need dependency. And so one of the things we try to do is negotiate particular service level agreements with the providers on behalf of the developers, basically, to make sure that the dependency will be there and they have what they need.
Yeah, so I think, as we mentioned before, I think at least right now, smart contract, the users of smart contracts tend to be a bit more ephemeral than normal API users, if you can say so. It's more difficult to be able to impose like restrictions on how data is going to be used and make commitments of the usage of subscriptions over time. I think also I think it's a bit of the nature of people who develop smart contract-based systems that they want to be able to verify it. So ideally they want, like for example, if they're consuming market data from us, they want us to sign the data, and they also want that signed data to include a signature from the data source and so on. They want to at least have the ability to verify everything as far back from the source and through all the steps as much as possible. And that also requires standards for talking to all the different upstream providers so that you can have this possibility, because you need to actively engage every participant to be able to do this.
So actually, can I get a quick show of hands? How many of you guys are building applications on Ethereum or etc.? So this question was about developers. For me, it's two things. things. One is we want to meet you where you're at, which is everything you normally use to interact with Ethereum, JSON RPC, normal REST calls, WebSockets, or however else it is native to you. We support that. So that's just the base level, right? The second level is education. I think all of us kind of hinted at it, but like it's really difficult to interact in these new ways and learn about Chainlink and learn about how you interact with these sectors. So we focused a lot on the education of how to actually connect your contracts. If you looked at our blogs, you can see most of them are tutorials. How do you actually execute X? Or I just published one recently about all the things you can do with Chainlink, because there's a lot of awesome ways you can interact there.
Maybe a follow-up question to you guys, if you will. You mentioned data signing. So do you have data providers that sign the data at the source? Or is it more like you guys are signing like halfway on its way to the subscriber?
We're talking to our upstream providers about it, but we haven't been able to make it happen yet. So right now it's only signatures from our side, which doesn't really mean that much. What you want to ensure is the integrity of the actual information that you get. So yeah.
We're just a proxy. You can send a transaction, but it has to be pre-signed.
This is something that we have had for so many years.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like we're quite lucky. We have quite a lot of people, so we might just open up the floor for some questions from the audience, if that works for you guys. Right. I guess you can just ask a question and we'll take it. Alright, so the question is, do you guys see WebAssembly changing your operating model?
WebAssembly, like everything else, we want to support because we are just a data provider that wraps around current languages. So if you write WebAssembly, if you compile down to something, but ultimately we will like add support for those things so that you interact in the way that you want to.
Yeah, I think it's kind of like asking as a web app provider, web app developer, does WebAssembly change anything? Well, not in a structural or fundamental way. It's something you can provide to make things work.
I guess from our point of view, having logic-based virtual machines on the chains can make them more efficient, but from our perspective, it sort of improves the companion chain and not really much Streamr itself. But I think also it's good progress taking us in the right direction.
This is something that we did. I wanted to be as an example. We set up this bounty distributions.
Is the financial data you put on the blockchain, is it encrypted or is it readable public for everyone to read?
Because if you want a smart contract on the chain you're publishing it on to be able to react to it, it has to be unencrypted. So that essentially means that if anybody requests this data and is going to use it, it immediately becomes a common good, so to say.
Are you being compensated to pass this data onto the blockchain?
I think it is more, are we compensating the provider from the system, right?
Well, I mean, like, there are models on the blockchain, right? Like, for example,
I think that's why there's not a lot of people streaming data to the blockchain that are wildly expensive. But in terms of like data and it becoming a public good once it's on the blockchain, my CTO once described it as certain data providers aren't selling data, they're selling secrets. They have data that is more up to date or more current, and so in selling it to us, they are to a certain degree taking a risk. Or we have other providers, ones we're in talks with right now, who their data set is just updated once every 2 weeks or so. And hypothetically, if the wrong user got its hands on it, they dump the data set, suddenly they're not a business anymore. You know, these things So there are problems with that, and we try to solve that by working with
Yeah, that's a good point, and I think another element to that is going back to what you said before about dependencies and availability and reliability. So sure, if you observe somebody else made a smart contract that publishes the data points you're interested in, you could piggyback onto that, but can you be sure that that will be there tomorrow if you're building a production system that's relying on this? And can you be sure that they keep on serving the data that you think they're doing?
I think you're kind of inferring what can I run as a business on top of this if I was a data provider. For us, we actually have it split. So we have a freemium model for some of our API data, and so a lot of that is just pay the regular Chainlink fee, which is likely one link token. But then if you configure your adapter with your API key, since we're a traditional SaaS model, the subscription fee gives you that API key. You can configure that and have all the extra crazy aggregation data that we provide as well. So it's kind of like, I don't know that there's a way today that Chainlink could streamline all of that, but you can actually do a couple different ways so that the provider is also getting paid as well as the network of Chainlink.
Yeah, well, maybe better. Yeah, just like a side note that, of course, the data points that the smart contracts get have to be some sort of aggregates, or they have to be, the sort of split-second picking data anyway. And yeah, I mean, just Streamr, the sort of very premise of Streamr was that you could build these sort of aggregations with these Streamr canvases, in which case you don't even need the original data points. You just make a very coarse aggregate that your smart contract needs, such as did it rain yesterday, yes or no, and then whoever wants to make further use of that, they can try that, so I don't know how much in your business models have you considered sort of like publishing aggregates kind of thing, or do you actually publish raw data to smart contracts?
So the way we do it is that we actually expose all our entire core API available through our Chainlink contract. But as part of the request, you can also include aggregation parameters. So the raw data will never see the blockchain. You will get a single data point, and you will specify how that data point is derived from the raw data. So,
does it fit with the producers being fidgety about releasing the data? Okay, so it will never be actually published, it will be just a coarse aggregate. Does that help with the negotiation?
So you mean like if the data is pre-aggregated?
Yeah, well, what I mean is that when the data producers are very jealous about their secrets, that could you, is it an argument, could you tell them, no, we are not actually going to spoil all your secrets, only like a coarse aggregate or something, that you're not really losing much. I don't know, I mean, is this even like a
Yes. So once I all our data, so we don't expose tick level orders, for example. You can get orange sensitivity down to the minute level. And even if you, like, it wouldn't really make sense to, just like you were saying, like, it would be wildly stupid to like try to get all the tick level trades or orders or something, because the volume is just so huge, it's going to like cover up the entire Ethereum network, and it's going to cost all the you might spend in the beginning. So,
yeah, but I mean, it's more like probably like suppose there is some sort of logistic tracking system or whatever, and then somebody would just be interested in what one company, maybe a competitor does, right? So maybe that competitor has a legitimate interest that they don't want to tell us or whatever. I don't know, I mean, I guess you could make it useful even with one data point by seeing how quick your competitor does their shipments or whatever. But I guess, like, I mean, the whole thing is that there's always the level of how you give, like how you market the data, right? How you package it and how somebody subscribes it. And then there's the level how they actually use it. And of course, they will never actually use it in the smart contract. As you say, you cannot push everything there. They will only ever use some aggregate of it. So in some ways, the data producers will never be losing quite as much secrecy as the packaged product. I mean, that's just what I'm saying. Is that something that makes it easier for you, or is this like not really a talking point?
Yeah, well, I can just add one thing on that, and that is like you have the different stakeholders, like from a data provider's perspective, you kind of have to trust the node operators because they're doing the aggregation, so you're effectively exposing their own data to the node operators. So there's kind of a balance act there, like which position do you take and what level of trust do you put in the other entities in the system.
I think, as you're pointing out, like some of this problem is solved by the fact that smart contracts are generally highly privileged, right? So Bloomberg can charge $30,000 for a terminal because they are selling you secrets. They can get you the financial data fractions of a second faster. But a smart contract, let's say you're gambling on an earnings report, you're not dumping the whole earnings report. You're not like putting all that data out there and sort of moving your secret. You're probably gambling on one line. Like how big was the profits? It wasn't enough.
Yeah. And if you could buy just like if you could sort of say, okay, you're giving me all that 30,000 volts or whatever, but I'm going to only ever pinky promise you this one line, you know, that sort of thing.
Yeah, and again, I think that's like they need to have a full understanding of how smart contracts work in order to take that step. But that is one possible way of sort of getting it.
Because they would be probably much more willing to, you know, if the smart contract is something you can trust, it always works the same way. So perhaps the pricing should be done not per the data package that you're selling, but like, so this smart contract wants to use your data. What is that contract's price? Because you can inspect the contract and see, oh, it's only doing that thing, or only you know, consuming that thing, and then you could like price it just for that contract separately, you know.
That sort of is one way to do it. I think the better one, though, and what we've had more success with, is getting them on board with smart contracts. If they get that 2001 Space Odyssey moment where they realize what a smart contract 5.0 would look like and what it would mean for them and their data, they're on board. So we could approach them and sort of sell them job by job, but I think it's more effective to try and get them to do that educational process. Because if you can do that, navigating all these areas of friction becomes infinitely easier.
I have a question to you and all this. So you mentioned earlier like this educational challenge of sorts. And we're also seeing like sort of mind shift that needs to happen in various organizations to start embracing new kinds of data economies that can become possible. Could you all elaborate a little bit on like what kind of change needs to happen? What are the things that you find organizations, both your data providers and your customers, are comfortable with and also
One of the things we found is that data providers often in the industries that their data represents. So a sports provider is going to be a professional weather provider to be a meteorologist. And so while we're going to data provider, they're going to know
there are two things that we're going to do in this world.
they know everything. But other providers, while they all tend to be very smart and very technically inclined, they're not necessarily going to have someone understanding.
So first of all, we're going to do some
the business
blockchain.block
process is often really intensive.
I'm going to give you 2 stickers for each of you, also the facilitators.
Like it's work, but to a certain extent it sounds like we're all doing it because there are people who are part of the system. We don't get API providers to the cities and maps.
So I think one technical component that can sandwich a lot of the concerns that data providers have about their raw data being exposed and collected and aggregated in trusted exchange environments such as SPX, because then you can remove a big part of the trust that needs to be put on node operators and intermediaries, so that they can do the aggregation that you were talking about without them being the humans running the nodes being able to stash away the analytics.
Yes, a couple ways. Just going further on the education side. Those that are working with dApps have an onboarding problem, not just a data problem. And then you stack everything in between. So it's not just about, hey, we can provide you some data. It's also why. Why do you want some of that data to come into your smart contracts? And then how does the user actually interact with that? So that's the biggest thing that we're trying to address is, hey, if we want to actually use outside data in a safe execution of blockchain, why would I want to do that? Because I want to keep everything that I have in the blockchain and just do logic on that. So part of it is the education of, if I'm, let's say, a trade station and I want to get my market data, I want to see all of the trades on chain, and I want to bring that into what traditional investors are looking at, but I also want to trust you on that. That's something that takes a lot of steps forward in talks with them, or just allowing them to verify that information, and then also, how do they actually integrate it into the apps that they're doing? That's what we're working on.
Just to add to that, though, what we found is that if you can sort of walk them up to that point, they get really excited. Like they want the developers there so they can help promote the developers. They'll do what they can do, whatever they can help with on they're willing to do. They want to tweet about it. They want to help the developers get out and get going. But you have to do that extra work to get them.
For us, an interesting phenomena we're seeing is that, like, when we talk to organizations, basically, they're used to the business model where the most value for them comes out of keeping the data in a silo, like closing it up, keeping it a secret, and this new opportunity of opening up a little bit and looking for those data monetization opportunities, that's a scary new world that not everybody wants to enter into. While it could actually increase the value of it. I mean, these could be device manufacturers, or making car manufacturers, or OEMs making parts, or whatnot, factories, everything really. But they could optimize their processes by exchanging data with each other, but it's not happening because they're locked down to this mindset, like this is mine, don't come close or I might, sort of thing. And that's something that using blockchain technology and decentralized technology could actually be disrupted to unlock some value from data sharing.
Yeah, I think you're touching on a good point there, and one big mind shift that we had was back when Kaiko started out, we treat the data as a commodity, basically. You pay us and we give you data. But we realized that's not really the value that people want. They want the service of getting the data or the license to use the data. So as you start looking at data not as a commodity, but you're looking at the service you're providing or the rights to use the data in certain ways, it's not anymore as scary that some of the data becomes public, because that's not your core value, right? That your IP is not consisting of the data itself.
I mean, just to add to, let's play devil's advocate for a second. If I was going to destroy AmberData or Kaiko or whoever else, I actually built a little demo app just because I wanted to test this. If I went and took all the raw data from our Chainlink connection, and I set that up and built an aggregator, and I did aggregations for, order books, or if I did that for OHC, or if I did that for some of my events for my contracts, that actually was extremely expensive. And then I was thinking, okay, what if we sharded? What if we did a side chain? What if we did state channels? It really doesn't quite economically make sense, because you're still missing out on the fact of the uptime. You're also missing out on that data recency. Like if I want to go collect from multiple exchanges, or if I want to collect from multiple blockchains, it's always going to be the same latency issue. So I think there's still the need, and there always will be the need of the data provider, and you need to be able to validate that that data provider actually is giving you accurate data.
I think that was really the goal of the panel, to have discussions like this. I think we have time for one last question. All right, I guess maybe to end one last question from me. It would be really, what was the biggest challenge you faced building your business, and how were you able to overcome it?
I think we've touched on many of the challenges, and roughly they are divided to technical challenges, maybe legal challenges, and let's say educational challenges. I think there's major ones in each of these, and it takes time for sure. On the technical side, the biggest challenge is to build a robust, trustless system for sure. Like how to create algorithms and a network where basically anyone can participate, but no one can harm it. In a sense, and building the incentive mechanisms, which were only like early days on that part, and how to verify things. That if we have a network of like thousands of nodes, how will that behave? What about millions of nodes? Where does it end? Where does it break? That kind of thing. On the legal side, for sure, like one of the early issues was just getting the fundraising done, but that was like 2017. But perhaps could be mentioned as one of the biggest challenges. It was very unestablished still at the time. It still is. And it maybe hasn't even gotten easier, like in 2 years. At the moment, maybe on the legal side, it's more about considering GDPR, considering how users can use this safely. We're building tooling for creating data unions, basically, which means that a large group of people can come together. Maybe they're owners of a particular device, like a Fitbit or a Tesla or whatever, and they can pool data into a product and then sell that to people interested and get compensated for it. So basically end users could earn with the data that they're producing, but this is extremely complex from a legal point of view because there's so many participants. It depends on what kind of data it is. Health data is more strictly regulated than some machine data, like a sensor measuring temperature or humidity or whatever. So this is something we're trying to build a framework for, so that people developing these applications can sort of get an out-of-the-box template for the legal framework for their application and fill in the blanks and then go with that. And on the education side, as you guys mentioned as well, there's various mind shifts that need to happen on all levels. Also onboarding developers and making that part easy, but also in the big organizations to start to change the way that they are used to operating and hoarding that value versus participating in a more open ecosystem and making data more available.
I think for us, and maybe a lot of startups have faced a similar situation, we were trying to do all this business development, all this education, selling providers on this new model, and getting all this done when it was just unicorns and fairies. It was all a hypothetical marketplace that we were, discussing on behalf of. Now that the thing is actually up and running, now that we have this thing to point to, now that we've built the tool that developers can use, we've done the thing, things will start moving along. We've got some exciting things coming up.
If we just look on a very practical level, like what are the most difficult challenges for us on a day-to-day basis, I think it consists of the main problem that a lot of our customers use us for, and that is solving fragmentization. So what I mean by that is like if you look at like how from the sources of like crypto exchanges, there's no standard nomenclature. You can have, for example, there's two tokens, both called USD coin, and there are different stable coins around the same value of $1, and different exchanges will have different coins that they call USD coin, and some of them will use the same code for different currencies. We also have like undocumented differences in semantics and API and stuff like that. And I think this class of fragmentizations in a broader sense is the biggest challenge for the Ethereum community and the blockchain space in general. Like if we look at layer 2 solutions, I think we have more layer 2 solutions than we have people who want to use layer 2 solutions today. And I think we need to try to seriously start to talk about forming standards bodies. So like, how do we talk about these things, and how do we name them, and can we agree on like common protocols? So like, just look at things like F 2.0 work now. Like you have an agreed upon way of like how we solve consensus and shards and all this, but how the clients talk to each other, like the network protocol, that's something that they're only starting to look at now through just like the developers talking to each other. And I think this needs to be formalized a little bit. And I know that like in this space we like to hold like formalization of stuff at an arm's length, but I think it's really necessary to be able to make something useful and get both liquidity and interoperability properly.
Yeah, it's definitely difficult. I know, just to answer what you're saying, they're definitely heads down on that spec, and they're still working on that. A lot of the chats with them. I think that the real issue is that the governance is not pushing funding forward and finding those folks that are talented to clear that spec, and there's no one really taking the charge to do that. But to go back to your original question, like, what are the challenges for AmberData? A lot of it is making sure that we have all the data available, easy to access, all the data that we do collect from different exchanges and from different blockchains, that it's all verifiable. Some of the challenges with exchanges and with the let's say, non-decentralized providers is how do we validate all of their actual volume and all that stuff. So for us, it's a lot of that, providing that context for all of the developers and for the end users, making sure that it is good and sound data.
I'm just curious, like what's your stance on like verifying volume, for example?
For us, we look at all of the order books and all the trades, and if we can marry those two blockchain transactions, that's something that we can actually validate. For the things that are just reported, this is probably an awesome feature idea, but maybe just signifying, hey, this is what the exchange reported versus this is something that we can nail back down to on-chain. Since we provide both of those things, it's up to the apps and the developers to make sure that, you know, they're actually reporting the real volume to their users. I'm sure that's something that you guys have encountered as well.
Yeah, but you know, like on centralized exchanges, it's difficult. Like you could have one Bitcoin being transferred and then that Bitcoin being traded back and forth a million times. How do you know that all of those are not wash trades? I mean, it's a tricky question. You have very sophisticated research papers that are trying to solve this, but it's kind of an unsolved problem. You can only make statistical guesses.
Awesome. I think that was the last question. So thank you everyone. Like, this was an awesome discussion. Don't hesitate to stick around. We have some really nice events coming up also. And thanks again to the speakers. It was really a great talk.
Thanks for moderating and thanks for inviting us. Thank you.